Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Andy, could you come out, please? Everybody remember Andy? Our student, my assistant producer. As his brother before him, who headed off to Harvard as a senior, we have now the same situation here with Andy. Andy is heading off as a senior to Wake Forest in North Carolina. So I basically want to say my gratitude, Andy, as well as it was with your brother. I never would have thought we had two guys that I have to look up to and keep but we're wishing you a lot of success at Wake Forest, and I know you'll be happy and things will turn out fine for you. On behalf of the Veterans Group, we want to present you with that and wish you really well. Okay?
Thank you. Andy knows how much we appreciate him and how much we're going to miss him. But life goes on. College awaits. Memorial Day is right around the corner. And there will be appropriate celebrations on Memorial Day. And Lorraine Marquis, the chair of the Town Celebrations Committee, will just take a moment and tell us what's coming up for Memorial Day.
Hi, I just want to give you an abbreviated version of Memorial Day because I had flyers printed up that has all the information on them that you would like. We do a ceremony, and we start off by visiting memorials and monuments. And there is quite a bit of walking in it, so if you feel like you don't want to follow the parade and do the walking, you can always meet us at the Green at like 11:20 for a celebration or a ceremony, as we put it. So feel free, please take a flyer, and I really hope that we get a good audience. TCC puts a lot of work into what they do, and it's really nice to see people out there that appreciate it. So hopefully I'll see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have an announcement of something of interest that they would like to share? You know, George Burnell is not here today, because if he were, I bet he'd have something to say. Okay, well then let's move on, and let me tell you a little bit about our speaker, Attorney Michael Manfreda. Mike is a trial lawyer by profession, but he's a historian by avocation. And he credits his love of history to his father, who taught doctoral and graduate students at the University of Connecticut's Graduate School. So now we go back in time to around 1914. The United States was doing really well. The United States was an economic powerhouse. The economy was rolling along. And nobody was the least bit interested in getting involved in a foreign war. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson was reelected in November 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But only 5 months later, everything changed, and the US declared war on Germany. And that's what Michael is going to talk about today, is primarily the intervening 5 months, what happened to change the United States position. And he'll begin by going before the war to trace some of the origins of the war, and then he will mostly focus on German aggressive behaviors that made it just impossible to stay on the sidelines. And as you will see as we progress, he's got some wonderful illustrations and photographs and videos. So I think the talk is going to be extremely entertaining as well as enlightening. Michael Manfreda earned a BA from Holy Cross in 1974 and a JD from Suffolk in 1977. After serving as an assistant district attorney in Boston, he opened his own firm, Manfreda and Associates, specializing in criminal and civil law, federal litigation, intellectual litigation, and professional responsibility. And for years, he made sojourns down to Connecticut to do stints in teaching high school English, history, science, and math. So with that, let's hear what he has to say. Please welcome Attorney Michael Manfreda.
Thank you very much. Well, I quit going down doing those talks because somehow geometry went out of my head. I don't know, one night I spent too long in Scully Square or something like that. Historians have called World War I unnecessary and avoidable, and that's debatable. But what we cannot debate is the impact of the war. It wiped 4 empires off the map. It killed and wounded 30 million, mostly military. After the war, 50 million more would die, mostly from disease and malnutrition. In the United States, 500,000 would die. They have to be considered casualties of war by influenza. It gave a foothold to communism and fascism. It guaranteed a Second World War. It impoverished the British Empire and established European protectorates, quote unquote, in the Middle East, the imprint of which we can still see today. It also launched the foundation of the creation of Israel and the League of Nations, which was rather worthless. And the vestige of that today is the International Court. It also positioned the United States as the world's leading power, and progressive legislation would continue more rapidly. There'd be labor and safety regulations, women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment, and the first civil rights movement since the end of Reconstruction. Now, if I'm using this presenter correctly, we'll see. These are members of the 26th Infantry Division, also known as the Yankee Division. They came from all over New England, but mostly Massachusetts. And by 1917, they would be fighting for their country and their lives in France. How they got to be there is really the subject of this talk. That process began not in the United States, but in Europe. You've all seen this map which shows the Triple Entente, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and marginally Bulgaria on one side, and the United Kingdom, France, Italy joining later with Russia on the side of the Triple Entente. As we go through, we're going to see it's not quite as predetermined and not quite as blocky as it appears. This is an ethnic map of Austria-Hungary, made mostly of Austrians and Hungarians, which makes sense. It also had Croats, Bosnians, Serbs, Slovaks, and another 15 or 16 ethnicities. For the last 100 years, the sick men of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, had been losing influence in Eastern Europe. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was picking up the pieces. It had already annexed Herzegovina, which angered Serbia, because even though there was a large Bosnian population in Herzegovina, they considered it to be part of a greater Serbia. This is the same kind of talk we heard in the 1990s, as if nothing changed. Now, Serbia was also a target of the empire. Serbia was Slavic and it was Orthodox, but it had a big buddy who was also Slavic and Orthodox, and I know you know who that was, Russia. Same kind of thing as in the 90s, with the Russians supporting the Serbs. Now, the empire had a secret police to keep track on all this, and it was terribly run, poorly financed, very inefficient, as was most of the rest of the empire. And historians have described the Austro-Hungarian Empire as absolutism mitigated by sloppiness. This is France in its Second Republic. It would be thoroughly humiliated by the Franco-Prussian War. It was a dispute, who could have guessed it, over the Spanish succession, again, the throne being open. The Germans and Prussians advanced a particular candidate, and that was not acceptable to this man, Napoleon III, who was the ruler of France. And he said, you keep pushing that candidate, there's going to be war. So Germany and Prussia withdrew the candidate. That's not enough for him. He wants an apology, and he wants it today. But he doesn't get an apology. Instead, he gets a sledgehammer right between the teeth. A massive German and Prussian invasion right through Alsace-Lorraine. Don't you hate it when that happens? To say that France was brutalized is an overstatement. The army was broken 3 times over. The emperor was himself captured. The Germans and Prussians did a happy dance under the Arc de Triomphe, and they remained in Germany and in Paris here and France until the French paid 5 billion francs in retribution, which meant about $25 billion in today's money. This begins a revanchist period in France, the desire to get back the national honor and get back Alsace-Lorraine at all costs. And 2 generations of generals, officers, and enlisted men trained for that day. That day they knew was going to come. And it all relied on the attack. And the attack relied on CRAN, C-R-A-N, which unfortunately is not French for common sense. What it was the desire to grapple with the enemy no matter what the cost, and destroy the enemy. By 1914, France would also manage to have designs on Syria. Other than the defeat and humiliation of France, the first result of the Franco-Prussian War was the creation of the German Empire. From Palatinate states created largely by Napoleon, southern states which were largely Catholic, and by Prussia. Schleswig-Holstein and others had already been attached by Otto von Bismarck. This was the First Reich, and it was the lifetime ambition of this man, the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. With a philosophy of blood and iron, and shrewd diplomacy and judiciously chosen wars, he welded together the First Reich. And he was always a cynic, but he didn't lack for a sense of humor. And he said, in politics, I have learned never to believe anything unless it has been officially denied. He then went about setting a foreign policy to keep Germany out of trouble. The first principle was that Germany had no need for further territory. It had the biggest economy, the largest population, arguably the most educated, the best railroad system, and the biggest industrial plant. And it made sense to invest in that. Secondly, that they should do nothing to antagonize Great Britain. It was a sea power, Germany was a land power, and if anything, they should try to ally with them. And he also said, if you're thinking of antagonizing Great Britain, remember one thing. The United States speaks English. Which means he wasn't afraid of the United States militarily, but it was its ability to produce that terrified him. You know, as far as the United States was concerned, kind of thought of the United States as a Pollyanna. It didn't have to fight for its existence and to scrape and scrabble like any normal country. But he is famously quoted as saying, God has a special providence for lost children, town drunks, village idiots, and the United States of America. The third pillar of his foreign policy was, as powerful as Germany was, it could not fight a two-fronted war. To handle that, he isolates France by uniting with, in an alliance with Austria-Hungary. Because of the Serb problem, he enters into a reassurance treaty with France, with Russia, so that if Serbia is an issue, the German Empire and the Russian Empire will consider each other to be neutral. In other words, regarding Serbia, Austria-Hungary was on its own. That's what that boils down to. Now, the first two emperors paid attention to him and kept him on as chancellor. This is Wilhelm I. You can see how happy he is about that. And what he tried to do was to actually get alliances with Great Britain. But the French were always running interference. His son, Friedrich III, was ostensibly a scholar, a humanitarian in peace and in war, and also followed the Iron Chancellor's point of view. But you know, it couldn't stay right for long, could it? No, no. That's not the world we know. So we have a new Kaiser, which, by the way, means Caesar. Wilhelm II, the product of a breached birth with a withered, useless arm that was always photographed as if he could do something. He was intelligent, well-read, erratic, and emotional. And he had a chip on his shoulder that could break the back of a bull. And what he wanted was, you've heard this phrase, all of you have, a place in the sun for Germany, which meant foreign colonies. He also had designs on Polish Russia, which was always against anything that Bismarck would have wanted to have happen. But the new Kaiser had a fix for that. He fires the old man. This is a Punch cartoon called Dropping the Pilot. There's Bismarck being let go. And when you drop the pilot, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know where you're going. And the first thing he does is get involved in a disastrous naval competition with Great Britain, killing any possibility for an alliance. And because he still has designs on huge chunks of Russia, he allows the reassurance treaty to lapse in 1893, which draws the French closer to the Russians. Bismarck's nightmare is closer to being a reality. This is not who I wanted. This is the Russian Empire. Can't show it all on one slide because after 400 years of expansion, it covered 1/6 of the Earth's surface. It had the largest, worst trained, worst equipped, worst disciplined, worst fed army in Europe. It was also the last absolute monarchy in Europe, and the only place where you could still now and then find serfs. It was thoroughly humiliated in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Half the fleet was sunk by a surprise attack in Vladivostok. Sound familiar? The other half steamed all the way around the world, only to be sent to the bottom at the Battle of Tsushima. 250,000 Russians would be torn to pieces in Manchuria. Despite this, the French still continued to count on the Russian steamroller. And Russia became more and more dependent on Russian loans. Russia also had its own designs, still, against the Ottoman Empire, mostly, as usual, in the Black Sea and for warm water ports. And if an opportunity arose, they'd take advantage of it. Great Britain had no territorial interests on the continent, but its primary goal for the last 200 years was to make sure that these invasion ports, including Antwerp, would be in the hands of weak nations or neutrals. Obviously, why? That's why it guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. The only He didn't have a treaty with France, but the map makes you think it did. Instead, they had a letter of understanding, and if France were invaded, Britain would consult with them. Now that would make me sleep well at night, wouldn't it? The British are going to consult with me as the Prussians come in for a third time. Do you see critical mass building up here at all? Don't worry. Everybody had a plan. And we're going to talk about two of them. Oh, sorry. This is Ferdinand Foch, Tiger of the French Army, and the author of Plan 17, which, to be fair, was a lot like Plan 16, 15, 14, 13. This is Alfred von Schlieffen, scholar of the German General Staff, and probably the author of the most famous military plan of the 20th century. And he worked on this thing for 20 years, 24/7. He would go to Belgium, go to Holland, go to France, measure the diameter of bridges, roads. He did this day in and day out. And if you did the same thing without break for 20 years, you'd look the same way he does. This map shows how the two plans generally did not work well together. Here the French would stab through Alsace in the rain, relying on crime. And they go as far as they can, attacking day in and day out, night and day. From the other side, off the map, the Russian steamroller would grind Germany into the dust from the east. For von Schlieffen, two-front war, no problem. A 1 million man claw will, what happened there? A 1 million man claw will plow through Belgium, envelop Paris, and then as the weak left arm drew the French in, they would slam the door behind them and destroy the French between the two sides within 30 days. And when that was done, they would use the best railroad system in Europe, which it was, to take all that power to the east and destroy the Russians. What could go wrong? Can't imagine. Now, every good powder keg needs a spark. And this is the last Bismarck quote, I promise. He said it many times, and probably at least once over a glass of schnapps, that if anything was going to set Europe ablaze, it was going to be some damn nonsense in the Balkans. I'm sure many of you have heard that quote. This may not be the damn nonsense, but it's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew of Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and heir to the throne. This was his wife, Sophie. They would eventually have 3 children. By all accounts, she was a thoroughly lovely woman with a wonderful personality, very kind to anyone she met. However, she committed the mortal sin of not having a single drop of royal blood in her body. So the emperor was against their marriage. So they had to promise that the marriage would be a morgantic one, which means that the children could never inherit the throne. They would eventually have 3 children. On June 28, 1914, Sophie, being pregnant with their 4th child, and the Archduke visit Sarajevo in Herzegovina to inspect military locations. It has a very large Bosnian population, but one of them generally loyal to the empire, and a smaller, not very happy population of Serbs. They go through the city in a 5-car motorcade. You can tell that a lot of people are happy. You know, they're waving flags and they're cheering. You can also tell not everybody's happy, because a bomb gets thrown against his car. It bounces off and blows up next to the car behind it, right behind it, sending several people to the hospital. They go to the city hall, and there he notes that there may be some Serb bullets waiting for me. And the two decide to go and visit the people in the hospital. Now, what happens right after that, we're not quite sure. The car seems to take a wrong turn. And the car has to stop in order to turn around. At that moment, a gunman gets up on the running board. He fires 2 shots into the chest of Franz Joseph and 1 shot into Sophie's abdomen. The Archduke's last words were, "Sophie, Sophie, please don't die. You have to stay alive for the children." The 2 were gone in moments. In seconds, the gunman is grabbed, thrown to the ground, and the gun ripped out of his hands. It's not very often that you get to look into the face of someone who had put the world into hell for years, but take this opportunity. Gavrilo Princip, a 17-year-old nobody, a nothing, a would-be member of the Serb Black Hand National Group. He would spend the next 26 years in prison for his crime. 1 month later, Serbia and Austria-Hungary would go to war. In that intervening month, which is the subject of a whole different talk, is either the clockwork that leads inextricably to war or the train wreck that leads to the same result, depending how you look at it. Both are true. In the meantime, the French are urging Russia to mobilize because they have the worst roads in the business, the worst, even worse railroads. And the Tsar universally, which by the way, Tsar means Caesar, universally described as not very intelligent, not very involved, not very reflective, and always influenced by the last person to whom he spoke, is there with his advisors and generals with a mobilization order in front of him. And they're going back and forth for hours over this. And then at one time, one of the generals just has had enough. Well, the Kaiser, is still sending him love letters. Your cousin Willy, it's going to be all right. And the Tsar says, it is just difficult for me to decide. And one of the generals, I'm sure he really hammed it up, rolled his eyes like this up to the 40-foot ceiling, which had to be there, and said, yes, sire, yes, it is difficult to decide. Now that got under his skin. He grabbed the pen, grabbed the order, and wrote the Russian equivalent of Nicholas Rex under the order, and said, there, I decide. One of the generals who had been arguing against going to war and against mobilization left the room holding back tears. Nicholas didn't know it, but he had signed the death warrant of Imperial Russia, his own death warrant, and the death warrant of his entire family. Things moved very quickly after that. Austria-Hungary mobilized, Germany mobilized, and France mobilized. When Germany plowed into Belgium, the British came in on the continent with all they had, which was 6 divisions. This map is here only for purposes of illustration. The French stab at the center as they planned for 20 years, 40 years. They run into thousands of machine guns and huge caliber artillery. They are torn to pieces in what's called the Battle of the Frontiers. Inside of 3 weeks, 300,000 Frenchmen are lost forever. Things do not go well either in the north. They start to approach Paris, but the attack can't be properly supplied. The men are marching 30 kilometers a day, 25 kilometers a day. You start to be able to see the ribs on the horses. Moltke, the chief of the general staff, says, if we're doing so well, where are the prisoners? But on balance, it's much worse for the French. they start to tumble back toward the center of France. Panic is starting to set in. And as many of you know, nothing goes faster through a military group than fear. It looks like it's going to be another rout, just like the Franco-Prussian War. And one man puts a stop to that. Joseph Joffre, Marshal of France and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of France. He had 4 o'clock in the morning courage. We don't have time to define it. Most of you know what it means. And completely unflappable. So he sends out an order that all the units will retreat in good order, in communication with their flanks, and they will go to a line east of Paris. And there, all of us together will resume the offensive. The last part of that was the pipe dream. No one had any idea how to do that, but it stopped the panic. In the meantime, due to stupid marching orders on the German side, a gap begins to open in the German claw. In what's called the Miracle of the Marne, the French and the British exploit that gap, drive into it, and the Germans are no longer able to effectively communicate across the front. They have to withdraw. They go to the high ground, pursued by the French and by the British. And they have to dig in. But they dig in along the high ground. The Germans and French have to dig in on contract, in not the best locations. They each try to outflank the other in a race to the sea, to the English Channel. Inside of weeks, there are 400 miles of trenches from the Swiss border all the way up to the English Channel. And these trenches would be very elaborate indeed. But they created a new kind of real estate not seen before, called no man's land. The space between the lines, where there was blood, shell holes, death, but not hope. No one could make any headway. Millions would die over the next 3 years in that new real estate. Who in his right mind would dive into that? This is the United States in 1914, called by both sides as the Great Neutral. The largest economy in the world, with a massive population of 100 million, the producer of coal and steel, and twice the gold reserves of any other country on earth. It also had a long tradition of no military alliances with anybody, not since the Revolution. And in the Northeast, there are a lot of good Irish Democratic voters, and in the Midwest, a lot of good German Democratic voters who, for different reasons, weren't going to lift a finger. First, the Irish, not to help the British Empire. For the German people of German extraction, they didn't want to fight against the fatherland. They still had German cultural societies and German language societies. This was fine for this man. Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912 because of a split Republican Party, he ran on a progressive ticket. And he didn't want a foreign war to interfere with that ticket. Also, he knew who his voters were, Democrats, and they didn't want to get involved either. He also believed that the United States was to be the example to the world, and he in particular, and that the only way for a new world to be created was for the United States to shape the peace, and the only way you could do that was to be neutral. So he enacted several bits of neutrality legislation. First of these were cash and carry. No loans to any belligerent. If you want to buy bullets, you come, you buy your bullets, you pay your money, you leave. That's it. Simple as that. After a period of a few months, it wasn't quite that simple. A system of credits would arise, and billions of dollars in credits would be given to the British. It's important to know that almost immediately, That neutrality began to erode, mostly by self-inflicted wounds from the Germans. This is what is known as the Rape of Belgium. When a Belgian farmer fired back at the invading Germans, one of the troops would cry out, "Franc-tireur," which means free shooters, or snipers, which means that reprisals were in order. So they bring a couple of hundred people to the center of town and shoot them and burn the town to the ground. This even happened if nobody shot at them. You could tell where the German army was in Belgium by looking at the horizon and seeing the columns of smoke coming up from the towns that were being burned to the ground. This is the town of Louvain, which was not fought over. It was a cultural capital of Northern Europe, and it had one of the most famous libraries in Europe, which had irreplaceable medieval manuscripts and Roman texts. This is the library after they got through with it. For the first time all over the world, Germans are called barbarians, and they give the British a propaganda coup they couldn't have paid for. One example is this recruitment poster, where the phrase "Rape of Belgium" is used, showing a Prussian eagle's claw crushing Belgium. There would be enough emotion still in this issue for it to be the basis of an American poster 3 years later, saying "Remember Belgium." And here, as usual, Belgium is depicted as a young girl, here being dragged off to God knows what fate. This is Edith Cavell. She was born in Norwich, England. She was about in 1865, and she was working as a nurse in Belgium when the Germans invaded. She did what she could to spirit out of the country Belgians, French soldiers, British soldiers, so they could rejoin the fight. The Germans took umbrage at that, and she was arrested, tried for treason, and condemned to death. She becomes an international cause célèbre. Letters come in from all over the world, including the Vatican and Washington, begging for mercy. Even the general staff nudges the military governor of Belgium. Maybe you should go easy on this one. But no, the rules had to be obeyed. She's ordered to be executed. Then the legend arises that she was taken to her place of execution, which was a graveyard, and it was too much for her. She just fainted, dead away. And she was shot down on the ground by a German officer. If you look into the poster, you can see she's about 25 years younger than she was in reality. This incident also becomes memorialized in a postage stamp. Remember Edith Cavell, murdered October 12, 1915, all over the empire. The New York Times writes an editorial about Edith Cavell. To this day, Mount Cavell is in Alberta, part of the Canadian Rockies, and it rises to 11,000 feet, almost twice the height of Mount Washington. Another thing that nudged disfavor for Germany was its first use of poison gas. The first gas it used was chlorine, which was a vesicant. You would drown in your own fluids. It was relatively easy to defeat, and you want to talk about that, we could do that in the question and answer period. And also they used mustard gas, which was an irritant, which could burn from the inside out if breathed in, leaving burning lesions on the surface of the body. They also used phosgene, which was an enhanced version of chlorine, more difficult to defeat. One of the few weapons banned throughout the entire 20th century was poison gas. And today, by international law, and we've seen an example of it very recently, any nation has the authority to punish the use of poison gas. But nothing helped move that pendulum away from neutrality than the use of the submarine. By the beginning of the war, both the British and the French had a practical submarine and a weapon to go along with it. And both used them against our shipping. The only difference was when we protested, the British stopped. This video gives an idea of what some of those submarines were like.
One weapon that revolutionized the war at sea. The submarine, or U-boat, as the Germans called it. When war began, the British Navy had more submarines than Germany. Life on board was in stark contrast to the big battleships.
To me, it was claustrophobia, or whatever they call it. You know, I didn't like, I liked to be where I could get out. I didn't like to be closed in. And submarines were terrible, really. They were small and so vulnerable.
It was all volunteers. Reason to get a shilling a day extra. And there wasn't many submarines, so we didn't want a lot of men volunteer. But as it went further on, we got more, and Wisconsin, they had to go in. I didn't want to go, but they had to go. But after we saw them after, they were delighted. And the submarine, they're always one, you see. You're the lieutenant and I'm a stoker. We both work together, because you get hit, you've got to know what to do, you see, in a submarine.
The British used their submarines for patrols in support of the surface fleet. The German U-boats would have a totally different purpose. They became the lone hunters, and they gave Germany its one truly effective naval weapon for war. Much of a U-boat's lonely time in the ocean was still spent on the surface, allowing moments of peace and calm.
After an excellent supper on the fresh fish given to us by our fishermen friends, we were glad to clamber up on the conning tower to enjoy the northern evening air and the cigar. Grey and violet hues replaced the shining glow of sunset.
Underneath the water, as the U-boat went in search of its prey, life became very different.
The atmosphere below was really beyond description. An appalling burst of heat from the decks. The thermometer stood at nearly 45 degrees Celsius. The men were standing over their engines in the bare minimum of clothing, and their drawn, cold faces, smeared with oil and filth, looked like skulls.
In September 1914, this new underwater threat showed its murderous potential. 3 aging British battleships, the Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy, were sunk in a single day by one German U-boat. A British midshipman wrote home with the remarkable story of his survival.
Dear Granny, I had a most thrilling experience. We were woken by a terrific crash and the whole ship shook. The Aboukir went down suddenly and we slid down her side into the water. I swam to the Hogue and was just going on board when she was struck and sunk in 3 minutes. I then swam onto the Cressy, where I had a cup of cocoa. But as I finished it, she was struck. I jumped off again. I was picked up, having been 3 hours in the water.
1,400 other sailors lost their lives. The U-boat was able to sneak up on its target without being seen.
That's it. That's not a freeze, that's as far as it goes. In January 1915, Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare on ships approaching the British Isles and France. Sinkings go up astronomically. During the war, U-boats would sink 5,000 merchant ships, and over 30,000 merchant seamen would lose their lives. Wilson remained adamantly neutral, still chasing the chimera of negotiated peace, a new world under the leadership of President Wilson. On May 1, 1915, the Royal Mail ship Lusitania left New York Harbor with 1,924 souls aboard, bound for Liverpool. The German government had been putting these notices in the shipping news since January, which essentially say, go anywhere near the British Isles in a British ship, you could be blown out of the water without any warning. People didn't even see these anymore. Not only that, they didn't believe that a passenger ship would be targeted. Similarly to early in World War II, people didn't believe that there could be a Holocaust. This is the point of Kinsale in Cobb, Ireland. And if you had been, as some villagers were, looking out to sea on May 7th at around 2:11, you would have seen the Lusitania right around here. Because water carries very well over the water, you would have heard a roar, a boom, as a German torpedo slammed into its side. She would sink in 18 minutes. And in the meantime, they would hear the screams and the howls, people trying to save themselves in the water. Many people in Cobb wrote in diaries during the Second World War that at night they could sometimes still hear those screams. They did what they could to get out to them, but 12 miles is 12 miles, so it took, after they got out there, no one who was not in a boat was alive. 169 bodies were taken out of the water, and other bodies were washed up against the Irish coast. Royal Marines dug mass graves, and a funeral cortege went through Cobb. It started with the whole town turning out just before sunrise and went all the way to just after sunset. Of the 1,924 who went on the Lusitania, 1,201 were killed. 128 of those were Americans. This is the monument to the lost at Cobb today. There are a lot of poignant stories about the loss of the Lusitania, none more so than the story of Vanderbilt and Frome. Alfred Vanderbilt was one of the wealthiest men in the world. Carl Frome was a well-known playwright. They told two of the stewards to save themselves, and they would go to the nursery and get the infants that were in the nursery out of it. There are about 7 of them in there. So they put together wicker baskets, which Vanderbilt called Moses baskets, and feverishly tied on life preservers as the water began to rise. They waited for the water to be the right height. They took them, all the baskets, guided them out over to the rail and out into the open sea, to the encouragement of people in distant boats. As the last of the Lusitania went under the Irish Sea, it took with it all 7 baskets, in addition to Vanderbilt and Frome. And this is the guy we can give credit to for it. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, who saw his handiwork through his periscope. And he put notes in it for us to read. Great panic must have reigned. Some boats full to capacity are rushed from above, touch the water with either stem or stern first, and founder immediately. Whether he stayed through the whole thing and got bored and left, we don't know. But, see that bauble under his chin there? That's the medal he got for sinking the Lusitania. That's the medal he got from the Kaiser for sinking the Lusitania after the parade. And not just any medal, but the Blue Max, the Pour Mérite, the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award Germany could give. The news hits home like a thunderbolt. You've all seen this headline all over the country. This was Boston. Same thing with editorials. At this point, the desire for war with Germany is as high as it has ever been. German businesses are attacked. German organizations are attacked. And German cultural societies tend not to meet this month. And people are asking, advisors are asking Wilson to go after the U-boats, including this man, Colonel Edward House. He was a Texan, a politician, and a confidant of many of his day, and he was an informal member of Wilson's cabinet. He was given the title colonel by the governor of Texas, and stuck for some reason. He was never in the military. But Wilson, he has his own ideas. And he gives this famous speech that sometimes countries are so right, they don't have to fight to prove that they're right. So the United States is too proud to fight. Back then and now, people still ask, what the hell does that mean? And that includes this man, Teddy Roosevelt, talking to a crowd in New York, ready to throw his hat down in emphasis, saying at the top of his lungs, by God, why won't that man do something? To be fair, more or less for the next several months, passenger ships were off the menu for U-boats. Until the Sussex. This is a ferry going across the English Channel, back and forth. It is attacked on March 24th, 1916. 50 people are killed by a German U-boat, and it's almost blown out of the water. Several Americans are also killed. What remains of the ship makes it home. I don't know about you, but I couldn't make it to the side of the road with this kind of damage. Wilson goes to a joint session of Congress, and he says, if this doesn't stop, we're going to cut off diplomatic relations. Yeah, I know. But the Germans realized that also, technically, that could be, well, not necessarily, especially given Wilson, could be a prelude to war. So they give the Sussex Pledge that passenger ships would no longer be attacked, that merchant ships would not be sunk unless it could be proven by search if necessary that they carried weapons or contraband. And merchant ships wouldn't be sunk at all unless provisions could be made for the safety of the crew. So far, so good. But in reality, that pledge regarding merchant ships, that was followed. But not always for merchant ships. And I wouldn't call, neither would Wilson call, sinking a merchant ship in the North Sea in March and allowing the crew to go into open boats, making provisions for the safety of the crew. But it doesn't matter. It provided Wilson cover. He could still cling to the idea of neutrality. And if a merchant ship is lost, he could look the other way. The election of 1916 is a very tight one, and it's all about the war. And that's our next video.
Milestone of the century. In 1916, the spotlights swung to the convention. The Republicans met in Chicago. They were determined to depose Woodrow Wilson, who had been the first Democratic president, save Grover Cleveland, since before the Civil War. Senator Warren G. Harding was convention chairman. Representing the old guard was Chauncey M. Depew. The rains came, but that didn't keep away the inevitable suffragettes, picketing for a Votes for Women plank in the GOP platform. The Republicans nominated dignified, impressive Charles Evans Hughes, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Here's a typical campaign portrait with wife and daughters. He was destined to go to bed believing himself President of the United States and to wake up a defeated candidate. Theodore Roosevelt was nominated again by his progressive Bull Moose party, but the old Rough Rider declined, swung his support to Hughes, and set off a rip-snorting speech-making tour. Two heroines of the Mexican border raids presented him with flowers of Albuquerque. "Bully," cried Teddy, waving the bouquet with typically hearty Roosevelt enthusiasm. Later, he demonstrated how to shake hands and keep the line moving. played the fire of old. Democrats met in St. Louis. Their cry was peace with honor, for Europe's war had become a national issue. Cabinet leader Murphy posed with young and rising Alfred E. Smith. There was little doubt that President Wilson would again be the Democratic candidate. For William Jennings Bryan, a brilliant career was drawing to a close. Brother Charles, he campaigned for Wilson. Later, resigning as Wilson's Secretary of State, the silver-tongued orator, 3 times defeated for the presidency, settled down to do some fishing. For Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a brilliant career was just beginning. In this rare and striking film sequence captured by a Pathé cameraman during Wilson's administration, we discover that handsome FDR made a dashing Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At Shadowlawn, his summer White House in New Jersey, President Wilson learned that he had been renominated by 1,092 votes to 1. Here we see Senator Ollie James, an orator of the old school, as he makes the official notification. His party hailed Wilson as the man who had kept America out of the European war. On election night, the presidency had been conceded to Hughes, but California swung to the Democrats to re-elect Wilson by a scant 4,000 votes. Truly a milestone of the century.
It was a very nasty election. And it gave rise to one of the 3 most famous political slogans in the country's history. Right up there with Tippecanoe and Tyler too for Harrison, and Happy Days Are Here Again with Roosevelt, which was, he kept us out of war. Now it's time to talk about Mexico, obviously. Relations with Mexico had gone between horrible to miserable and back again ever since the end of the Mexican War, with one civil war after another civil war, one person thrown out over another person thrown out, and one of those in this chain was Victoriano Huerta, whose preoccupation was murdering his political occupation, his political opponents, and people who happened to know them. Some of Wilson's advisors, for commercial reasons, including Colonel House, suggested that Wilson recognize him, but he wasn't pure enough for Wilson. He had to wait for Venustiano Carranza, who was a wealthy planter who in 1915 was elected from the Constitutionalist Party in an election that could maybe, maybe not, sometimes, on some days, could be good enough, not good enough, maybe fair, but good enough election so that it was good enough for Wilson to recognize him in 1915. So everyone's happy now except Pancho Villa, who tried to overthrow him, failed. So he thought he needed more support in Mexico, which he certainly did. So he decides to draw the United States into Mexico and use the United States as an enemy to garner support. So he starts attacking American interests in Mexico. On January 1916, 16 mining employees are taken off a train in Santa Isabel, Chihuahua. They're stripped and shot. A week later, something similar. Nothing yet from Wilson. On March 9th, 1916, he goes into Columbus, New Mexico, where the 13th Cavalry Regiment was located. 10 civilians are killed, 8 soldiers are killed, and for good measure, the town is burnt to the ground. Now that gets Wilson's attention. And he sends in this man, John Blackjack Pershing, with a cavalry regiment, and here you see him crossing the Rio Grande, sporting one of the best chins in the business, to go and annihilate Pancho Villa. Problem is, he first had to find him. And he would stay there, fruitlessly I might add, until January 1917, or shortly after that, they would all have something much more important to do. Germany is going through pick your vegetable, the turnip winter, the potato winter, and there are food riots all over Germany. So they initiate an exclusion zone. Anything found in the gray area will be shot without warning. Losses mount to over 300,000 tons. The next video will voice over making a comparison between losses in 1916 and 1917. Go ahead, Ed. It's toward the end we're supposed to be doing. That's all right, never mind. It's supposed to be toward the end. But anyway, in February 1916, 117,000 tons were sunk. In 1917, in February, 540,000 tons. In March of 1916, 167,000 tons were sunk. And in March of 1917, 593,000 tons were sunk. In April of 1916, 191,000 tons were sunk. And this is why April's the cruelest month of all. In April of 1917, 881,000 tons were sunk in that month alone. A total in 1916 of 2.3 million tons, and in 1917, 6.2 million tons, well beyond the British ability to replace lost merchant ships. Still, no declaration from Woodrow. Crickets chirping on the White House lawn. So far, so good. That's fine. But now, you can trust the Germans to do it again. This is Arthur Zimmermann, the foreign minister of the German Empire. He decides to send out this telegram, which offers to the Mexican German embassy, which offers a treaty to Mexico so that if war came between the United States and Mexico, and if Mexico invaded the United States, and if Germany were involved, then they would get, at the end of the war, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico back. Now you'll notice something funny about this. It was sent by Western Union through Galveston. Now how did that happen? Only with Woodrow Wilson would it happen. Using common sense, the British chopped out the German diplomatic cable at the beginning of the war. But at the suggestion of Colonel House, he'll keep coming back, he suggested that to be a good neutral, that they should be allowed to use the American diplomatic cable that went through Copenhagen. Two provisions, though. All messages had to be sent in clear. And you're not the kind of audience I'll translate that for. And it could have nothing to do with the war. That's great. Now this gets translated this is sent using the diplomatic code. We're not quite sure how it happened, but apparently one of Zimmermann's minions went to the ambassador, the American ambassador, and said, this involves, the honor of a lady, this could be a honeypot issue, we're not sure, but we could be wrong, and you don't want to ruin reputation, and the ambassador said, okay, fine, I don't need to know anymore. So it gets sent. So far, so good, though. The Mexicans might know about it, but they can't do anything about it. Wilson doesn't know anything about it, so everything's fine. Yeah. This, when we get to it, is the British Admiralty. And somewhere in that rabbit warren is room 40, which was the decryption office of the Naval Intelligence Service. And they had been listening in on the American diplomatic cable since the beginning of the war. They had also decoded the German diplomatic code since the beginning of the war. This is one of the crib sheets they had. And you can see Texas, Arizona. So they felt they were onto something. All of this was under the command of, at the time, Captain Reginald Blinker Hall. He was called Blinker because he had a nervous tic that made one of his eyes flash like a naval signal beacon. He had his pies, fingers and pies all over the world, but he knew he had dynamite in his hands. But he just can't give it to Wilson. He gives it to Wilson. The jig is up. First of all, they're going to know that they've been listening to him for the last 3 years. Can't have that. And even worse, the Germans are going to figure out that the diplomatic code has been broken. Very bad form for the head of naval intelligence. So he comes up with a plan, and he comes up with it quick. He fakes a breaking and entering in the German embassy in Mexico City and says this is where it comes from. And he makes sure it makes its way to Wilson. Now, Wilson thinks he has something here he might be able to use. He's trying to get an armed merchant ship bill through Congress. And the reasons to be against that, even if you're in favor of war or against it. So he's not getting enough votes. He thinks this might nudge it just a little. But this gives you an idea of Wilson. He was at no time a seat-of-the-pants gut politician with his finger on the pulse of people. He was an ideologue with an ideology only. He failed to see in his own population what the Director of Naval Intelligence in Britain could see, that it would set off a firestorm. And this anti-German rallies all over the country. German businesses are attacked, people of German extraction are attacked. Many members of the press were Democratic, and they wanted to stop the war. So they go running to Zimmerman. And they tell him, the Germans, the British faked this, right? You didn't send it out, right? Right? I mean, you didn't do it. It wasn't you, right? He had a chance. The thing with Mexico wasn't going to work anyway. It was stupid. The Americans want to hang Germany right now. That's the last thing in the world they want. He has his chance, but what does he do? He doubles down. And in addition to that, he says, thus I considered it a patriotic duty to release these instructions and hold to the standpoint that I acted rightly. Remember that anti-German rally we showed a little while ago? Remember that? Think of 50 of them. Now, reality starts to crash in on Wilson. He realizes the Germans no longer respect the United States, or him, that there's so much enmity against the Germans for this, that he couldn't get any traction at home at all for another peace initiative. And there may not even be time, because it looks like the British could be starved to death. And now he was finally accepting what people have been telling him for well over a year. If you want to shape the peace, you're going to have to be involved in the war. That no one's going to allow someone who has not shed any blood and not shed any treasure to dictate to the ones who had how the post-war world would look. So reluctantly, on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson goes to Capitol Hill.
Of the century. The events about to unfold before us happened over 40 years ago. Perhaps you were among the crowd that stormed the Capitol on that fateful day in 1917. Some shouting for war, some crying for peace. Inside the White House, President Woodrow Wilson conferred with advisors and signed the proclamation of war against Germany. The men who were present here are gone, but preserved on Pathé film, this moment of history remains. The news flashed. On the latest wireless transmitters, headlines told the story to the people of America, while the parlor radio was still years in the future. Everywhere there was cheering and waving of flags. Hindsight or cynicism might make us smile at the thought that this war was sometimes called a great adventure. Never again would we see our entry into a major conflict excite so many to such heights of elation. Naive? Probably. But here was a generation of young men not yet saturated by the paralyzing variety of self-analysis and the mock science. They believed. It is said that behind every man there's a woman, and America's women were, daintily but mightily. In the lead was General John J. Pershing, who had chased Villa in Mexico and who now found himself chased in turn by the shrill Bobby Sox Brigade of 1917. Appointed to head the American Expeditionary Force, which mainly had to be built from scratch, Blackjack Pershing became a national hero. Crowds cheered his every appearance, like this one, at an athletic meet featuring a frantic 100-yard dash by the Bloomer Girl. On June 5th, 1917, 10 million men got in line, as every American between the ages of 21 and 30 registered for the first U.S. draft since the Civil War. On July 20th, Secretary of War Baker pulled a number from a goldfish bowl and the great draft lottery was on. For more than 14 hours straight, officials drew numbers to determine the order in which the men were to be called to the colors. Across the nation, excited crowds watched bulletin boards like this one, run by a Jewish language newspaper. A soldier-to-be sees his number come up, and he goes jubilantly off, his head filled with dreams of glory. Soon the streets resounded to the departing draftees. By December 15th, more than 500,000 men were in training camps. The United States had to change its old ways of doing things. Affecting industry, government, and Americans everywhere, the conversion was miraculously swift. We prepared to place our might into the battle line, a formidable rocky resistance in this milestone of the century.
Obviously, not everyone was jubilant.
Yes.
Within a few days of the declaration, Woodrow Wilson received a visitor, Teddy Roosevelt. He asked for a meeting. Now, the two people in public despised each other, but in private, they hated each other. But he couldn't say no to the man because it would be in all the papers the next day. So he goes into Woodrow Wilson's office and he asks him to be given command of a cavalry regiment, just as he had in the Spanish-American War. This was not going over well for Wilson. He was not going to give this guy any more glory, not on his watch, so he turns him down flat. A couple of days later, he's having lunch in New York, a dejected Roosevelt with, again, the ubiquitous Colonel House. And he says, all I wanted was the opportunity to die. And the Texan looked at him and said, Theodore, are you sure you made that crystal clear to the president? You all know this man, George M. Cohan, who would finish his productions, each and every one of them on Broadway, by dropping the American flag down on the back of the stage. So even if people weren't applauding, they'd still be on their feet. He, in the first week after the Declaration, he composes America's informal marching song. The sheet music was very popular. It flew off the shelves. Things would move very quickly after the Declaration. 2 million men would sign up and 2.8 million would be drafted. They all had to be housed, fed, and led. And that would be in places like the Camp Devens Cantonment, which would go 10 times its size. there would be dozens of these all over the country. And then the men would sometimes have to train with broomsticks instead of guns. And they'd be taken from bigger boats, smaller boats to bigger boats, small depots to bigger depots, and finally to points of departure, to France. Here we see Blackjack Pershing arriving in France. 2 million Americans would follow him, and the world and the United States would never be the same again. And now, in the same way George M. would have, with the American flag.
And we are happy to accept your questions. Not we. And raise your hand so we can bring you the microphone, please. Who's first?
Was the Lusitania carrying munitions?
Well, there's no smoking gun on that. For years, the British government had banned any kind of search in there on the notion that if it did have munitions, it would be dangerous. Radar searches have not shown any. But it was one of the first excuses given by the Germans. In their first diplomatic note responding to Wilson's first note, that was the first claim they made. But over the years, the definition of the munitions changed from year to year to year. And at the time, the answer that it had munitions on it would not have satisfied any American as to the loss of 1,900 people. Anyone else?
Gresh.
Here we go. Mike,
Yes.
a question about the actual outbreak when the Guns of August time, when the outbreak of the war took place.
Right.
Would you just characterize quickly, I think the Kaiser of Germany was at sea. Europe was on a vacation, as it traditionally does even now in August. In your readings, is there anyone who could have stood up and made a real statement like, don't?
It's interesting because historians treat that fact differently. He was on vacation. SLA Marshall says it was the worst, most ill-advised sea voyage since the Titanic. But most have accepted that he was in as good communication with mainland Germany as he could be at the time, and it's not as if he ever really missed a signal or missed a message. Also, he was lied to by the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Bertholst. When the Kaiser looked at the response, the Serbian response to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, he said, "So good, seems all right to me." Then the Foreign Minister said, no, Your Majesty. We've already been invaded by Serbia, which was an outright lie. What it really is that toward the end, we had people trying to look good. And I think one of the best explanations after all these years is John Keegan's explanation, which is that there weren't enough people of goodwill in the right place at the right time to stop the cataclysm. As simple and as horribly simple as that. Anybody else? Yes?
Exactly.
Real, I don't need to Mike. What happened to the Kaiser eventually?
Oh,
After the war?
if we had some, of course, we're not talking about the end of the war. One of the most famous headlines is from the New York Times, and it says, Kaiser flees to Holland, which is what he did. There are those who surmise that one reason why the Germans didn't go through Holland was to give the Kaiser a place to run to. And in general, he stayed there throughout much of the next war, of World War II, until he eventually died. Anybody else? Yes?
Yeah, if the United States had not gone to war,
What would have happened?
It's difficult to see right? And given the shipping losses of the British that were totally dependent on food and oil and supplies from the rest of the world, it's difficult to see how they might have been able to hold out. But Germany itself had almost been spent at men, but that was just before the Americans arrived in the Kaiser offensive. That was an effort to try to beat the Americans to the punch after the declaration of war. There's the possibility that Germany might have been able to extract an armistice, whereby it would remain, as it had in the Franco-Prussian War, in possession of large amounts of France and Belgium. It could have happened that way. Whether that was the worst thing in the world, given what happened, is another question. You could say the same thing about Joffrey. What if he hadn't stopped the panic? He stops the panic, and that creates 3 years of stasis where people get killed. Maybe the war could have been over just then in the West. But people do what they think they have to do at the time, and you would never have convinced Joffrey not to send that order. It's just not the way people are. Yes?
It's amazing how there's always a trigger to justify some action. The Gulf will talk, and the sinking of the Maine. There's another one too. I can't remember offhand.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting to talk about that because one of the things that used to be argued was that it was the interlocking treaties that locked the countries in once the spark occurred. It's not really true. The treaty provisions didn't really come into play if you really read the treaties. It was the overarching ambitions of the countries at the time, including Austria, including Russia, and including Germany, that created the alliances and the agreement to go to war. Britain was the last to go in and was very reluctant and wouldn't go on the continent until Belgium's neutrality was violated. The trigger here, it's true that starts a process, the spark, but it was not inevitable. It didn't have to be, which is what I just said. There's two ways of looking at it, that it was like a clockwork, wound up, all set, everything predetermined, or that it was a failure of human nature. And I think that's primarily what it was. I don't think anyone's absence made a difference, or George V tried to do something. And Cousin Willie sent his letters out to the Kaiser, to the Tsar. But he wasn't genuine. He wanted a war in the East against his cousin. He just wanted to make sure he didn't have a war against Britain. He wanted a war on his own terms, as did most of the other powers in Europe. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Right. Anybody else?
Mike, can you comment on what were the early American divisions in Europe? Who were the first ones over there?
Well, the first one over there was the 1st Division. And that was directly, for a while, commanded initially by Pershing. And he always kind of favored that division. And that was run by General Liggett, as I recall. And Liggett ran into a bit of a problem with General Edwards, who ran the 26th Infantry. And really, if you look at it, Edwards was in the right. But the guy with the extra star was Pershing. And so Edwards ends up being ultimately relieved, sent home, and takes a training command. But Pershing's heart was always with the 1st. And remember, these were huge divisions, much bigger than they were in World War II. Yes, yes.
You mentioned the Kaiser was intelligent. I've always been led to believe he was a bumbling idiot. Was he both?
No. Whoever led you to think he was a bumbling idiot was wrong. And I'll tell you why.
So many stupid things.
Well, intelligent people can do very stupid things. That's why we keep most of them in faculties. Anything else? Anybody? Anything?
Well, will you be willing to spend a few minutes after?
Sure.
If anybody has questions that we haven't addressed, Mike says he will stay for a little while afterwards, and you can tell him then. Have we lost some keys?
Do these look familiar to
Yeah, they
anybody?
look like they're mine.
Thank you. Indeed.
Thank you very much. Let's give Michael a big hand.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.